My name is Desmond. I'm the chapter head of the UChicago Platypus chapter. I'll just read out a short description of what the Platypus Affiliated Society actually is. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. And we hold a reading group that meets every Sunday from 12:30 to 3 in Harper 135. We also host coffee breaks on campus where we discuss problems of the left. I guess you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I'm Ben. I lead the chapter at Northwestern University in Evanston. And yeah.
I'm Clay. I lead the chapter at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
Thank you. Y'all?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Perry. I serve as a senior editor for the Chicago Thinker, which is UChicago's new conservative and libertarian primarily organization on campus. We're a student publication. And to reiterate what our mission is, I'd just like to read from our mission statement. Some things are too sacred to surrender to the mob, and the free exchange of ideas is one of them. The Chicago Thinker challenges the mob's crusade against free speech by publishing thoughtful, conservative, and libertarian commentary, in addition to fact-driven reporting. In addition to that, one thing we've done more recently in the spirit of free speech is run this point-counterpoint kind of series where we have members of our staff who disagree on issues, nonetheless write articles against each other to some degree in establishing this spirit of thoughtful debate that we seek to defend on campus.
Yeah, for sure. My name is Ben. I'm the law school correspondent for The Thinker. I'm a law student and I write for The Thinker. And our website is thechicagothinker.com. It's great if you want to get some, alternative student views on life.
I'm Jack, one of the undergraduates here. I am a podcast host, so I'm usually on this camera, but not this big. And I'm happy to come there with David Flex or have a moderated discussion.
To be clear, the views that at least The Thinker is expressing are, at least by our members, are not representative of the views of The Thinker as a whole. We are partaking in this discussion as individuals, and the opinions and beliefs that we are about to express are purely personal and, like I said, not reflective of The Thinker's broader mission or values.
Now, the way this discussion is structured is that we have two primary questions about the American Revolution, about its legacy and its relevance today. Each question will be directed towards both tables, and each table will have 15 minutes to respond. And following each round of question asking will be 5 minutes for each table to respond to the other table. And then, and once we've gone through our two main questions, we'll open the discussion up to a Q&A.
Okay. Sorry, Hayes, if I mind if I interrupt, I actually forgot to mention that the Platypus Affiliated Society, we have our own publication, the Platypus Review, which is published every month. It's an open submission publication focused on problems of the left. You can find it in the back of the room. So,
Or here.
Yeah, or here or over there. Just mentioning that.
So we'll be breaking this dialogue up into two questions. The first question we want to ask is it the right or the left who can lay proper claim to the American Revolution? And our first question will be directed towards the Platypus table. On the left, today we see a diversity of perspectives on the status of the American Revolution. The revolution is compared to with the French Revolution of 1789, the Haitian Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, sometimes favorably and sometimes not so favorably. And additionally, many on the left hold the long-standing revisionist position, most popularly taken up through the 1619 Project today, that the American Revolution was in some capacity a means of preserving inegalitarian social relations, not abolishing them. Why is the American Revolution often severed from the lineage of real revolutions? And what was the American Revolution?
Should I?
Yep.
Do you mind if I stand up? Or okay, I find it easier to speak when I'm standing up. So I have prepared remarks, but first of all, I'd like to mention that I think it's a real canard to separate the American, the French, and the Haitian Revolution. We in Platypus will emphasize they're all part of one thing. And then I'll just say that before I go into my remarks, which will also split between speakers. On Independence Day, 1901, the American Marxist Eugene Debs declared, quote, "I like the 4th of July. It breathes the spirit of revolution. On this day, we reaffirm the ultimate triumph of socialism." When Debs was nominated the president of the Socialist Party of America at his 1904 convention, he claimed that, quote, "Thomas Jefferson would scorn to enter a modern democratic convention. He would have as little business there as Abraham Lincoln would have in a latter-day Republican convention. If they were living today, they would be delegates to this convention, that is the Socialist Party of America convention." Debs was a leader of the Marxist left at a moment of its greatest potential to transform the world. The Socialist Party of America, of which he was head, was not only the largest socialist party ever organized in the United States, but it was also only one section of a global socialist party, the Second International, with affiliated parties across the world and whose crowning jewel was the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, 2 million strong in Germany. His statements are a far cry from the contemporary American left today, which by and large reject and decry the American Revolution. Nevertheless, the American Revolution belongs to the left, just not the left of today, but the historical left, the high point of historical Marxism, as embodied by Eugene Debs and the original Socialist Party of America. It is only this historical Marxist left that was adequate to and genuinely struggled to realize the potential of the American Revolution. Indeed, it is precisely insofar as the contemporary left fails to take up the legacy of the American Revolution that it becomes not the left, but the right, an obstacle to the task of further social transformation, or what Platypus calls the dead left. What then was the American Revolution of 1776 for historical Marxism? In 2 words, a bourgeois revolution. This did not mean a revolution of the bourgeoisie, a revolution of the rich, the slaveholders, and the moneybags as it is so often thought of by the contemporary dead left. 1776 was a political triumph of a radical new modern society, bourgeois society, the society of labor. As Karl Marx wrote of the accompanying bourgeois revolutions to the American Revolution, the English Revolution of 1648 and the French Revolution of 1789, quote, "They were not the victory of a particular class of society over the old political order. They were the proclamation of the political order for the new European society." Since antiquity, more accurately the Neolithic Revolution, humanity lived in traditional civilization. These civilizations were fundamentally based upon a great chain of being, where people fulfilled divinely ordered roles determined by birth. Quote, "The ends of life are given at the beginning of life. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around." In France, this infamously took the form of the estate's caste system. The first estate composed of those who pray, the clergy. The second estate composed of those who fight, the aristocracy. And the third estate composed of everyone else, those who work, the commoners. Yet, beginning especially with the Renaissance, there emerged a new social principle to challenge traditional civilization, the right of labor. Members of the third estate, serfs and slaves, who escaped from servitude with nothing but their abilities to labor, formed free city-states, where instead of serving divinely given ends, individuals will participate in the free association of labor. There, private property began to develop. Private property not as something opposed to labor, but indeed the realization of labor. For as Locke wrote in his Second Treatise of Government, labor is the first property, and what gives justification to all other forms of property. What the ancients obtained through war and conquest, the moderns would obtain through work and commerce. Rather than a divine state of being in the traditional hierarchy then, in this new bourgeois society, bourgeois meaning urban, inhabitants of the town rather than the country, an individual's social worth could be determined by their own labor, objectified in their private property. They were free to pursue their own values in society in an open-ended process of becoming rather than being. The watchword of this new society was freedom, the freedom to become something one wasn't, the freedom to transform oneself and the world. The desideratum of bourgeois society was to realize the freedom of both the individual and the collective. There was no insoluble contradiction between individual or collective freedom, or negative and positive liberty, as Isaiah Berlin's Canard. In his discourse on the origin of inequality and on the social contract, Rousseau argued that individuals could achieve freedom only through society, for in a state of nature, as an isolated subject, one could only be a, quote, slave to the instincts, completely undifferentiated from others. Society enabled individuals to develop and thus become conscious of their own individuality, to exercise both the natural human power to pity, the ability to recognize identity across differences and differences across identity, and perfectibility, the ability for humans to transform themselves, to grant themselves a second nature that overcomes their first nature. Even when individual purposes were apparently antagonistic, Rousseau could still observe a, quote, general will in bourgeois society, a will that was more than the sum of its parts and which indicated unrealized potential.
Nowhere was bourgeois society more developed in the world by 1776 than in North America. North America was populated by those who sought a haven from the subjugation of traditional civilization. not only religious persecution, but also the economic and political domination of the landed aristocracy in England. In the New World of America, devoid of both the first and second estates, bourgeois society could develop practically uninhibited. Commerce, literary education, and civic participation were the highest in the world in North America before 1776. The American Revolution gave political expression to bourgeois society. The revolution was motivated by a consciousness of bourgeois society's increasing independence and the need to subordinate the coercive state, the bastion of the first and second estates, to the voluntary freedom of civil society. As Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense, quote, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in its worst state an intolerable one," unquote. The British Empire's imposition of taxation without representation, as well as other coercive measures that explicitly served to subordinate civil society to the state, and thus limit the potential latent in society, were seen as intolerable to the principles of bourgeois society. These principles were articulated with the Declaration of Independence, which spoke of the inalienable bourgeois rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness guaranteed to all men. The ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788 institutionalized the revolutionary principles of 1776. The contemporary left, by and large, decries the Constitution as a counter-revolutionary and undemocratic document. Think of today's abortion activists calling to abolish the Supreme Court. But this fails to grasp that the basis of bourgeois society is not democracy, but civil freedom. The Constitution's separation of powers was meant to preserve the dynamism of bourgeois society, the individual pursuit of happiness, and protect the rights of bourgeois society from the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the law. What was the importance of this history for the historical Marxist left? First, the left itself was only made possible by the bourgeois revolution, of which the American Revolution was exemplary. One cannot understand the left without understanding the American Revolution. As Leszek Kolakowski wrote in his 1956 essay, The Concept of the left is defined by a utopia, a mysterious consciousness of historical potential and the necessity of realizing such potential. The right, on the other hand, is defined by its opportunism, or adaptation to existing conditions. It seeks either to maintain the status quo or to return to a prior status quo. But the right cannot really return to the past. Rather, it ultimately functions to foreclose possibilities for the future. Members of the new al-Qaeda government in Afghanistan, or Taliban government in Afghanistan, complain that now that the war is over, rather than establishing the caliphate of old, they must work for a living. Bourgeois society persists. The concept of the left could not exist in traditional civilization. Spartacus, nor the Gracchi brothers, nor Jesus were leftists. Crucially, in traditional civilization there was not, nor could there be, consciousness of historical potential. At best, the challenges to the existing order in traditional civilization only intended to assert new chains of being in the world. Think China's explosive yet stagnant dynastic changes, or French peasant jacqueries. By contrast, in the American Revolution there existed a clear left wing, composed by such figures as Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, against the right wing of the Revolution that aimed to limit its developments to reclaiming the mere rights of Englishmen guaranteed by the English Constitution in a repeat of the English Revolution of 1688. The left, 1648. The left sought to universalize and advance the principles of bourgeois society. In the words of Thomas Paine, writing of the potential of the American Revolution, quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world anew. The birthday of a new world is at hand." Furthermore, when Jefferson wrote of the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, he was making a clear revision of Locke's earlier inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. For Jefferson recognized the radical bourgeois proposition that property is merely a means to an end and not an end in itself. The true end in itself was the open-ended process of social self-transformation. Jefferson would go on to abolish America's participation in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as spread the institution of slavery in the Northwest Territories, support the Jacobins during the French Revolution, and importantly, in a letter to Francis Wright at the end of his life, even expressed sympathy for the utopian socialism of Robert Owen as the continuation of the project of freedom.
As one cannot understand the left without understanding the American Revolution, similarly, one cannot understand Marxism without understanding the American Revolution. Here we return to Eugene Debs in 1904. What were the stakes of claiming that Thomas Jefferson would be a member of the Socialist Party of America? For Debs, the struggle for socialism would seek to realize the same goals as the American Revolution, the freedom made possible by bourgeois society. The Socialist Party of America was the only political subject genuinely interested in the continuation of the American Revolution. The Democratic and Republican Party to this day will still wave the slogans of the American Revolution, though most recently the Democratic Party may be reluctant to do so. But neither recognizes the need for the continuation, as both treat the American Revolution as an accomplished fact, rather than something which tasks us. By contrast, Debs as a Marxist recognized that since the Industrial Revolution, bourgeois society had been thrown into crisis, a self-contradiction of the very principle of the right of labor, expressed most saliently by the widespread phenomenon of pauperization and mass unemployment. A distinct class had emerged in bourgeois society despite the self-professed aims of the American Revolution to represent all of that society. This class was the proletariat, bourgeois subjects forced to sell their labor power as a commodity in a way that undermined their freedom rather than establish the basis for that freedom. The proletariat after the Industrial Revolution was struggling for their inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which can only be secured with a new revolution, a proletarian socialist revolution, which Debs and the Socialist Party of America sought to lead. Since there's no Eugene Debs or Socialist Party of America in the present, to whom does the American Revolution belong today? Only the capitalist parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, different flavors of the right, which both represent the status quo. The Democrats are not the left of the Republicans, and the Republicans are not the right of the Democrats. Indeed, at least in the present, the Republicans get to play the fair-weather friends of the American Revolution, but only as opposition to the Democratic Party's full-throated abandonment of it. The Republicans, therefore, have at least the virtue of aspiring to the ideals of 1776, while the Democrats deny that such ideals are anything but a white supremacist, racist trick. The Democrats inherit the 20th century legacy of progressivism, the attempt by the capitalist state to maintain what existed in light of a socialist movement which sought to overcome capitalism. Former President Wilson, one of the fathers of American progressivism, recognized that the Democratic Party must pay lip service to the Constitution, the legacy of the Revolution, but trespass it against in deeds, as capitalism required the state to stand above society in a way which defied bourgeois principles of old, in order to manage a state of permanent crisis. Nevertheless, the attempts by the Republicans to defend bourgeois society, at least at their most genuine, are ultimately quixotic. For it not only attempts to preserve bourgeois society past its inevitable crisis, but also falls below the promise of the Revolution to transform society to a higher stage of freedom. The right's defense of the American Revolution is ultimately the defense of what merely exists. When the contemporary dead left apes the Democrats and attacks the American Revolution for sexism, racism, heteronormativity, slavery, they really attack their own history and make the task of the left, let alone a Marxist left, obscure and incomprehensible. Really, the reason for the left's intensified hatred of 1776 has nothing to do with history per se, but with the present. The left's despair in the face of Trump, who by and large has maintained himself as a defender of the American Revolution. Indeed, the 1619 Project was born out of the failing New York Times attempt to shift from Russia to race in its criticism of the Trump presidency. The left looks at statues of Columbus and Jefferson and only sees Trump. But the problems today indict the present left far more than the founding fathers, for the present is the product of our own actions. It's what we make of it. If the left is indeed, as Eugene Debs believed, the only historical force capable of taking up the legacy of the American Revolution, that means it would be the only force capable of realizing its highest aspirations. In light of the failure to accomplish this, the responsibility of the total barbarism in which we live today falls on what the left did or did not do. If the left is to change the world, it must first transform itself.
We see this reflected in those who champion the principles of constitutional governance and limited government as necessary for a thriving political body, but also in those who passionately proclaim the imminence of the second 1776. Why does the American conservative movement hold on to this legacy? What principles guided the American Revolution?
Thank you, first of all, so much for being here. I know it's Monday night, and you could be doing other things right now, and you're listening to all of us talk. So, law student. The American Revolution, was accidental and it was reactionary. The 13 colonies would have been happy to continue under British management if only the British had been managing well, but they hadn't. And some of them, I guess, did continue. That's how we have Canada. It continued under British management for a long time after the American Revolution. But in America, it was not tenable, and the elites at the time made the best of the situation and used that opportunity to mainly accomplish two goals. And those goals were, number one, to create a British-style nation-state in America, and number two, to guarantee a basic standard of freedom and fair treatment for all Americans. And those goals were roughly supported by the two factions of the American Revolution. The first one were the nationalists, who later rebranded themselves as federalists because the word nationalist even got people a little bit on their toes back then. And I'm going to call these people the folk liberals. You could call them Jeffersonians. They later became Democratic Republicans, then Democrats under Andrew Jackson. But those two traditions, so the nationalists and the folk liberals. The nationalists wanted to create a British-style state in America, but with a different King George, our own George Washington, instead of that King George III guy who was in charge over in the UK. In line with that, they wrote the Constitution, and they based it heavily off of the British form of government. So we have a president. At the time, there were no term limits even, very much modeled off of the English king. And then you have our legislature, and then you have our judiciary, which is basically a common law judiciary, very much English style. And in line with that, the Federalists wanted to basically create a cohesive American nation and use the force of government to promote the common good. And so they started a national bank. You have Hamilton's Report on Manufactures around this time. Eventually, this tradition turned into Whiggism, and so then you get the Transcontinental Railroad, you get some early industrial policy and all that good stuff. And then the other camp is, I'm going to call these people the folk liberals. They did sometimes cite bad 18th century philosophers like Rousseau and Locke, who were, by the way, all bachelors. So just picture in your mind John Locke eating a piece of pizza over the sink, and that's kind of what was, I don't know. So they had a very limited perspective on life. And Jefferson did cite those people every now and again, but the real impetus behind the folk liberal portion of the American Revolution was those people just wanted to get rid of the British, and they wanted to not be oppressed by some monarchical government like the British. You could call this the Leave Me Alone coalition. And so later these people took on a sort of agrarian outlook, and their ideal was the Jeffersonian farmer tilling his own little plot of land, maybe with some slaves helping him out. And that was very much the ideal of Jeffersonian America. And then this turned into Andrew Jackson and the first real American populist movement. And I would say, in my opinion, the modern expression of that portion of the American Revolution is the modern American populist movement. So think of low-income white people from not very fancy geographic areas railing against vaccine mandates and wokeism. That's very much the same sort of thing that was happening in 1830-ish, which is how Andrew Jackson got elected. And also around 1800-ish, that's how Thomas Jefferson got elected. Both of those people drew votes from Appalachia. I don't know if there were that many people in Appalachia in Thomas Jefferson's era, but it was the same sort of cultural phenomenon happening. I would argue that the sort of folk liberal wing of the American Revolution is not accurately represented by modern-day neoliberals. So you have the right wing of neoliberalism, which is Koch brothers funded libertarianism, free trade, open borders, tax cuts for corporations, you know how it all goes. And then you have the left wing of neoliberalism, which is, Warren Court, hippies, gay marriage, wokeism, all that stuff. Both of those movements are elite and very new, very much like post-1960s, at least as for when they took power in the United States. And the Jeffersonian folk liberals who helped bring the American Revolution about don't really share much in common with the neoliberals, other than maybe quoting some similar philosophers. I think a lot of them would look at modern neoliberalism with kind of vague horror, to be honest. So that's my thought.
Okay. I guess I'll go next. I have a slightly different interpretation as Ben here, which is one of the wonderful things about the thinkers that we have a wide diversity of views. I'm sure Jack will say something completely different from me, but before proceeding, I'd like to make one key point. John Adams famously remarked after the Revolution that we can't just simply look at 1776 as embodying the American Revolution. He, in fact, thought that the 15 years before the Revolution were actually just as important from an intellectual point of view. However, I'd like to argue that I think it's equally crucial to include the period from 76 to 87 as part of the American Revolution as well. When the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, or at least most of them did, they didn't collectively envision a cohesive political direction for the new Confederation. It was clear that the years following 76 were crucial in a trial and error sense as they debated and came to terms with the uncharted waters they were treading. I find 1787, for example, to be the ultimate case of compromise between the Founding Fathers and their wide breadth of visions for the new republic. So, on the kind of what we would indirectly say the left would be figures like Paine, figures like Jefferson, figures like Samuel Adams. Those who I would associate tend to be more on the right in this sense would be figures like John Dickinson, George Washington. You can sort of put Hamilton in there, but that gets kind of complicated. Nonetheless, with that being said, I think the Revolution was by intention a conservative one, but functionally a more liberal one, lowercase L and C, to be clear. I see the Revolution as the Founding Fathers' intent on restoring the British Constitution and reclaiming the empire, an empire of liberty from the grasp of corrupt cronies like the Earl of Bute, George Grenville, and Lord North, basically King George III's buddies and friends, who the Founding Fathers thought were intentionally and seditiously reducing them to slavery, the sort of white libertarian view, to say. But at the same time, what they actually did was modernize, if not completely revamp, the British Constitution. This is sort of the left side of it, one can say. The key point here is that the British Constitution was not some sort of singular document, but rather a collection of crucial statutes such as the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta. To separate these two notions from each other, then, is to avoid a necessary element of the Revolution as a whole. The Founding Fathers generally looked to bring the imperial British Parliament on par with the more democratic colonial systems of government they knew all their lives, at least for 100 years with the charters they had. They heralded reformers like Algernon Sidney, John Locke. They toasted John Wilkes' parliamentary reform movement back at home as championing liberty and looked in horror as the establishment sought to suppress Wilkesite licentious popular politics. In fact, they actually would wear hats with the number 45 in commemoration of John Wilkes' North Britain number 45. But with the exception of a few American radicals, independence was viewed as a backdoor option, even as late as 1775, after skirmishes at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. The Founding Fathers still felt that reconciliation was tenable. As indicated by the very moderate Olive Branch petition, their taking up arms was to force the empire to sit at the negotiating table with them on equal footing. But even after the declaration, preservation of the British Constitution was a paramount priority. Washington, observing the Redcoats landing in New York Harbor, told his countrymen that they were fighting to defend the British Constitution from usurpation. But at the same time, they clearly had a different view of the British Constitution from the de facto Tories in power, and thus, or de facto Tories, they're not actually Tories per se, but nonetheless, they reimagined the canon moving forward. These Tories rejected popular sovereignty and placed it in the institution of Parliament more broadly. Key example, Samuel Johnson. This was not just a Tory view, actually. Moderates, even, like Edmund Burke and the Marquess of Rockingham, agreed with this but sympathized more with colonist complaints. This created the paradox that while the imperial crackdown in the 1760s had substantial legal justification, it was nonetheless a novel parliamentary assertion of power in the eyes of the colonies and fed the conspiracy of an empire-wide siege against age-old English rights and liberties. By 1787, however, it was clear that though the Founding Fathers envisioned the American Empire, yes, American Empire, as the millenarian restoration of the former British Empire, what they actually created was something completely different. A more democratic and participatory society that rejected hereditary privileges, noble titles, monarchy, all that fun stuff, actually in the Constitution, and a strong union of 13 states that upheld life, liberty, and property. One can certainly take the full revolution, as intentionally conservative but functionally liberal. Once again, lowercase c, lowercase l.
So, again, thank you for having us on. Glad you're looking out. I'm going to take a fundamentally different view than my colleagues at the Finger. mean, I'm not great at introductions, so I'll start with a quote, a kind of quote, I guess, I can't remember exactly. So, Abraham Lincoln once said that the Constitution is the frame of silver that lines the apple of gold, which is the Declaration of Independence. So, because of this, the American Revolution, I agree with Perry, should go up to the Constitution at least. We have to look at what principles were endowed within the Declaration of Independence, and I believe that's fundamentally a liberation from what was believed to be an oppressive regime, one that took away the rights of England. It is because of this reason that I say that the American Revolution is fundamentally a left-wing revolution. So, I get it. There's a conservative side to this as well, but the reclamation of British rights, which is a conservative project, they thought they were a certain tradition in order to reinstate that into the Constitution, or at least the government that they thought they were going to have after the American Revolution. But the system that they put in place is fundamentally a liberal one. Like liberal democracies, as we all know, is the American experiment, which drove a lot of revolutions around the world, that at least tried to follow some sort of democratic experiment afterwards. So, with that as the very basis, I think that liberalism inherently leads toward the left-wing march. And if you want to argue that comparatively the United States is not as far to the left as other countries, I would just say that the absolute metrics say that we have definitely gone far to the left in the original Constitution we ever intended. And of course, there's a lot of history to go along, right, with that. But I'm not here to, I didn't prepare a historical story, I prepared more of an ideological understanding of what was going on with the American Revolution. So, as far as it being a liberal revolution, liberalism inherently relies on liberation in some form or aspect. And in the American Revolution, that was essentially that the American colonies were trying to liberate from England for a conservative end. That being the rights of individuals were denied, no taxation without representation, no spiel. But because of that, the system that they put in place, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that inherently sparked a revolutionary nature that would remain within the United States. So liberation now becomes the end goal of the state in American society. And you can see that now. Of course, you have the sexual revolution, probably going on. Of course, you have also emancipation of African Americans, which you all feel is good. But I mean, it just continues on throughout American history. It's a recurring goal. So, in one of the most fundamental aspects, that being the basis of American society, there was a massive liberation in the fact that secularism now became essentially the law of the land. And you can see this with the fact that established churches, as early as 1776, began to be destroyed. Whether that be, you can argue that was early as the Anglican Church trying to get the Church of England out, but that disestablishmentarian view continued on for essentially the entirety of America's history, with the last established church in England in 1833. So now we have established that Christianity was one of the dominant forces in American society and continued on for quite a long period of time with the Great Awakenings. It ultimately did not have the same authority that it did have within the legal spectrum. But Christianity, and thereby natural law, which came from the Catholic tradition, was inherently the reason as to why common law, natural law, the legal precedent that was built upon Western society, that was now out the window. So, in my opinion, the Constitution was nothing more than a positive law, the positive law, essentially. And with no basis, that inherently makes it difficult for the right wing to claim, essentially. Positive law inherently leads to the whims of the day and the legislature's ability to change the law. So, as far as that is concerned, that is why I fully believe that the American Revolution was a left-wing revolution. But to answer the two questions that were posed to us, I do think the American conservative movement, at least the traditional one, holds to the American Revolution, because that was the new standard. Since that was the established law of the land, there was a basic understanding in the old British history that you were to stand by the state and its laws as just a member of the citizenry, as a patriotic act. And as we can see, patriotism has gone down, so we'll see how that ends. But generally, people were meant to stand by the law and stand by their country. So, I'm almost out of time. But I guess I'll leave on to say that the principles that guided the American Revolution were fundamentally liberal ones. And explain kind of on the Platypus side, the American Revolution as a liberal one inherently leads down a more progressive path. And I don't mean progressive as in the 20th century, I mean how we now, or left-wing, a left-wing term of things. So I do not think that the American Revolution could be considered a right-wing revolution, although the American conservative movement is the dominant party that seems to claim it. Thank you.
Now we'll move to responses, beginning with the Platypus for 5 minutes.
I'll just, I think I'll just start by saying, like, why are we even discussing the American Revolution? Who cares? It's in the past, right? It's history. Oh, who cares what happened like 200 years ago? And I think that was partly what our remarks were meant to address. It's because the American Revolution seems to return, right? Like, it seems we're living with problems that the American Revolution was meant to address. You know, there's like controversies over free speech. There's controversies over the right of free association, freedom from the state. So these questions seem to return. And then we ask ourselves, like, okay, then what does it mean that there was an American Revolution that tried to realize these principles, and yet we still seem to live in a society in which they remain unrealized? And I guess, like, I also mentioned this to not turn this, like, I don't want people to think of this as like an academic exercise. Like, we're just talking about what actually happened in 1776 exactly to the precise detail. That's not really the point. It's about how do you see, what does your perception of the American Revolution say about your philosophy of history? Right? What does it say about your philosophy of history? And one thing we say in Platypus a lot is Marxism is a philosophy of history. It's about history. So what tasks remain to be unfulfilled? And what problems have been bequeathed to us in the present? I guess one last thing, of course, like, again, to make this more present focused, because it's really about the present, right? Like, the contemporary left blaming Jefferson and John Adams, blah, 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 right? For what's going on, problems of today is like a complete excuse. Because really, of course it's an excuse because they're dead and we're alive. And we're here to make, you know, they have no power over us. We're the only ones, like we said in our remarks. I've been rambling a bit, but, you know, people look at Columbus and Jefferson and they see Trump. That's really true. That's actually true. That's the reason why people hate Columbus and Jefferson. It's because of the present. It's because of, it's symptomatic of the present that we return to the American Revolution. It's symptomatic of the desire to do something in the present. So just framing things that way. And so it's not just about like who's the better historian here or there. Not about that. Yeah, I don't know if you guys want to say something.
Yeah, I guess in your response, I'd like to know the first two speakers. I don't remember their names, but just sort of how are you relating this history to the tasks of the present? Is so I can kind of get a sense from the final speaker, what you think. But for the first two speakers, I'm just interested in what this history of the Constitution that you're giving relates to the present, and what tasks does that present to you guys at a level of, you know, politics or culture or something.
I was also interested, though, with regard to the responses of the first and the last speaker. Because there is something that's kind of interesting in that like Desmond said, it seems like there's a sort of way in which the past is being read in terms of like the present, but in a way that doesn't actually reflect on the present. In the sense that the first speaker says, well, the so-called like folk liberals are really kind of like a foreshadowing of like the deplorables of the present. And it's like, what's the meaning of that exactly? Because really what you're asking there is like, what's the meaning of those people in the present, rather than what's the meaning of that historical phenomenon? Because the history really becomes only a means to an end to understand the present. The other thing of the argument that the American Revolution is a left-wing revolution, maybe I would just challenge that of being like, is saying that a revolution is left or right wing actually adequate to speaking about bourgeois revolutions? Maybe actually, so the French and American revolutions obviously have a left and right wing, but the question is, what kind of purpose do they serve in history? So it seems to be something that's kind of underlying it, in that the left seems to be the force that kind of moves history, and that seems to be like kind of understood. But then there's the other side of it, and it seems that if the American Revolution is a so-called like left revolution, it seems to foreshadow like what the left has become today. They become like, it basically just becomes foreshadowing for modern progressivism, which is also a little bit of a strange claim, since the progressives are the ones that reject the American Revolution. But the thing that's actually being recognized there, it's actually through the bourgeois revolution and bourgeois society that the basis of progressivism could be founded on. That actually, it's on bourgeois society that the critique of bourgeois society can be made. But I don't know, those are kind of like scatterbrained thoughts.
How much time do you have left? A minute.
Do you have anything?
I think those are good summaries. And yeah, I think maybe this will anticipate.
I do have a question for the other side, though. Who do you think best embodies the American Revolution? I mean, it's kind of come up a bit. Like, if there was, of course, I mean, I know this kind of it's kind of like academic exercise, but like, yeah, we would say like Paine and Jefferson are the fullest realization of the American Revolution. Not Hamilton. Yeah, so I'm just curious, and why?
Sorry, would you want to explain for a second why you think Jefferson and Paine?
Jefferson and Paine, because they deepen the principle of the revolution. Especially Jefferson realizes that the revolution is not just about like preserving property rights. Yeah, it's not about the rights of Englishmen, but it's about the rights of humanity. Like, this is actually a debate that went on. Like, do we in like the Continental Congress is about, okay, are we just demanding the rights of Englishmen, or are we trying to set up a new society, a new political order which will guarantee rights for all of humanity, and not just the right of property, but the right of the pursuit of happiness, right? Pursuit of happiness is different from property, right? It's a deeper principle. It's more fundamental than just property.
If I could add one thing to that, and I think where Desmond's going with this is that it's Jefferson, you could say, best embodies the American Revolution at the level of the theoretical clarity by which he spoke about it, which is not to counterpose Jefferson to the Constitution, which was done on by one of the speakers. So the point is that the Constitution is still the consolidation of Jeffersonianism, or just of the bourgeois revolution. But Jefferson, in a sense, does have the greatest, most crystalline clarity on what the point, the big picture is of where we're going with the revolution, the social revolution that the American Revolution is merely a confirmation of.
All right, I appreciate those questions. I think I like how you say that Marxism is a philosophy of history, because based on my limited understanding of Marxism, that seems like a very good way to explain it. And I think it would be also accurate to say that conservatism, in a sense, is a philosophy of history, at least, and the term conservatism means various different things to different people, but in a sense, it is the insight that historical ways of doing things may be good and perhaps should be preserved looking forward. And in my opinion, the biggest question in politics today is, so we've had, ever since the 60s and the 80s, basically all of American society has been run according to neoliberalism. So you have Reagan Thatcherism, and then you have 60s hippie neoliberalism. And one of the big questions today is, okay, we have Trump now, which is sort of a sign in some ways that the neoliberal paradigm has failed, at least failed a substantial portion of the American population. What comes next? And the American Revolution, I think, is good because it gives us some ideas about things that we could use to replace neoliberalism with, such as nationalism and the idea of developmental statism as a paradigm for, industrial policy as a paradigm for economic growth. I guess another idea would be the British constitutional structure, which I think is great. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I guess just to sort of push back on the notion of, I guess just sort of add to what Ben is saying, and conservatism being primarily a philosophy of history, I would just like to use a quote by Edmund Burke in his Reflections on a Revolution in France, where he says, "Thus, by preserving the method of nature in the conduct of the state in what we improve, we are never wholly new. In what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete. By adhering in this manner and on those principles to our forefathers, we are guided not by the superstition of antiquarians, but by the spirit of philosophic analogy. In this choice of inheritance, we have given to our frame of polity the image of relation in blood, binding up the constitution of our country with our dearest domestic ties, adopting our fundamental laws in the bosom of our family affections, keeping warmth of all their combined and mutually reflected charities, our state, our parks, our sepulchres, and our altars." And I think what that represents is the pinnacle of conservatism, in the sense that it's historically we look at the past and we determine a lot of what we see in the present based on experience from the past, based on historical experience. And I think the Founding Fathers did the same thing. Like I said, they cited figures in the past, like they cited classics, they cited Greece, they cited Rome, they cited Sparta, they cited Athens, like Burgess, etc. But they also cited the reformers, like I said, of the British Empire itself. They cited John Locke, they cited Algernon Sidney, they cited Sir Edward Coke. And I think it would just be remiss to say that conservative, or at least the conservative movement as understood today, kind of is stuck in the past or is way too visionary into the future. I think we determine our present based on our experience from the past. So that's just sort of my point. I guess in response to who I think embodies the Constitution the most, or the Revolution, sorry, more broadly the most, I would say either, this is a tough one, I'd say probably George Washington or James Madison, but that's just my personal opinion.
Okay. So the claim about Marxism being essentially a way of describing history, I fundamentally agree with that. I mean, Marxism is basically the march of history to the end towards communism, if I'm correct. But, I mean, the epistemology that I would have would not claim any sort of determinism. The future is always uncertain, at least in the mindset that I have. So, as far as like trying to understand like what the thrust of history is, we can only interpret that in the means of looking backward. So, if we're trying to say like, oh, history will move towards this way, all we can do is really see the trends that are going on and try to make an accurate prediction. But at that point, I don't think you're really doing history. You're doing more political science in ways in how to influence the history. Of course, history is made by all actors. As much as we would like to say that it's either great men or like big social movements, like everyday people do drive history in some form or fashion because they constitute the majority of society. I mean, other than that, a lot has been covered. I do agree that Jefferson probably does embody the American Revolution the best. I think his ideals more than likely shape a lot of understanding of American society, particularly with relation to what made up the backbone of society for a very long time. That may either virtue as an Aristotle or God as an Aquinas or the classical tradition.
Just really quick, would you like to elaborate on why you think Madison embodied the revolution?
Yeah, I feel like George Washington, above all, had a very, I think they had the most sort of pragmatic vision for the American Republic. George Washington certainly in the sense that he was first and foremost a planetary second. He was the commander of the Continental Army, but he ultimately, I think, embodied the historical view. I know this is kind of beating the dead horse on historical exercise, but he, I think, embodied, like I said, the politics that existed in the American colonies before the whole imperial crisis of the 1760s. This guy, was a well-to-do planter. He was a gentleman by all standards, and he had a general aversion to public office, famously, and he could have set the precedent of the office of the president as anything he wanted to be, but the guy retires after 2 terms to get back to his job. And that was something that was very common and happened almost all the time, where public office was almost viewed as a burden. People would rather have stayed on their farms, stuck to planning or going back to their private lives. This whole creation of this public sphere is a totally novel thing. I guess Madison, I think I'd probably leave that to be explained in my response to your second question.
Well, thank you so much. In the second part of the dialogue, we will return to the present. Amidst a great conflict over the meaning of American history in a period where feelings of discontent and despair over our contemporary situation and our future prospects is abounding. We asked 2 overarching questions here. Has something been lost from the revolutionary spirit of 1776? And what can we take up from the American Revolution today? So first, to the thinker, have we strayed too far from the original aspirations of 1776? If so, how and why? What might it mean to creatively recuperate this lost sense?
Let's see. That is a great question. I think yes, we have strayed too far from the original aspirations of 1776. Specifically, over the past 60 or so years, the dominant sort of philosophy in the United States has become neoliberalism, and neoliberals have essentially sort of mismanaged several aspects of American society, which has led to a really bad place that we're in right now. So I mentioned this a little bit before, but just to reiterate, so we have on the right, you have I like to call them the Koch brothers, sort of corporate neoliberals, And these are the people who just want to cut taxes and have free trade and all that stuff. And as I see it, those sorts of policies have been really like hollowed out the American economy in a lot of ways. So the American economy today is very heavily like keyboard based. It's not really all that based in the real world. We can't build ships anymore or refine aluminum in the United States. All those things get done in other countries, and that's a real source of economic weakness. And then there's the sort of progressive side of that as well. And as I see it, a lot of the sort of progressive takeover of American culture has essentially ensured that elite cultural values are the basis for how policy decisions are made, rather than the desires or interests of working people. So you see this a little bit with like mass immigration. We have a lot of people coming into the U.S. without paperwork, which undermines the job security and the economic opportunities of lower to middle class Americans. We see just other, so like the administrative state is another example. I'm okay with having an administrative state, but the federal bureaucracy in its current form is essentially like strangling the American economy, especially the real economy in some areas. So it's pretty much impossible to build a new mine or oil refinery in the U.S. And it's hard for the economy to really, I would say like the last 30 years of economic growth has been kind of like on paper growth only. So you have a lot of like inflated real estate, finance, tech rents, pharmaceutical patents, stuff like that. But I really question whether there's like a real basis to the American economy. And then on the other hand, you have like birth rates have gone down a lot. It's a fact that most lower and middle income Americans don't have the benefit of an intact family growing up. And I think that's just a tragedy. I mean, most of us here are elites, and so we grew up with a mother and a father in the home, or some other sort of reasonable family arrangement, but which is great. And so I think all of that in general is just a sign that we're kind of in like late Soviet America in a way. It's sort of like we had the post-war era and that sort of social capital and the amount of economic growth that we had in the 40s and 50s and 60s was great. And then ever since then, it's sort of been like slowly unraveling. And in my opinion, I mean, things can't go on like this. Healthcare is becoming more expensive. Education is becoming more expensive all the time. I mean, it only like eventually like it has to kind of fall apart in some form. What comes next, though, I really don't know, to be honest. I think a return to some of the ideas of the American founding. So I think nationalism and the idea of using the state to promote the common good and doing that a little bit more effectively in the economy through a national industrial policy or something would be great. And also by like managing immigration in a sensible way and rolling up the American empire. We don't need 1,000 military bases around the world. As I see it, where the sort of American military-industrial complex is a huge drag on American society, and like it's just kind of foolish. And it's clear that the people running the ship are not really like they're more concerned about this liberal international ideal than they are about advancing the national interest through foreign policy. So that would be a great thing. Also, I'd love to see a restoration of some of the same standards of basic fairness that we got with the American Revolution, as expressed in the Bill of Rights, including freedom of speech. It's the fact that, I mean, discussions like this, like we're having right now, can't happen on most college campuses because right-wingers are too radioactive to be allowed to express openly. I mean, you're getting any eggs thrown at us. Thank you very much. And that's just like that's not good at all. Also, so during the Civil Rights Movement, there was this promise of like freedom from discrimination and the idea that people would be treated equally regardless of their race or gender, which I think is great. Affirmative action and like modern day progressive racial nonsense is a major violation of this. White people and Asians and men deserve to be treated fairly, the same as other Americans, and we should return to those sorts of basic standards. And like universities and other groups just shouldn't be allowed to practice affirmative action. It should be shut down by the government, like it was during like discrimination was during the segregation era.
Yeah, I guess so I have two kind of views on this. One is building on the economic point. One thing that the Founding Fathers railed against constantly was this general tie-in between the British state and its economic system. I see that primarily in the British ministry basically in bed with the East India Company, which they viewed as this terrible kind of domineering government, which actually caused a famine in the 1770s, which is partly the reason why they were so opposed to the Tea Act and detested the British East India Company. I think that spirit has been lost today because we so readily accept things like government bailouts of these giant corporations and government inevitably, again, being in bed with a lot of these giant businesses. But I think another issue, which is sort of diverging almost in kind of contention with Ben said, is that I think we've grown to regard states as almost vestigial political units. Our founding fathers dedicated their allegiance first and foremost to the respective states. For example, before the Revolution, Maryland probably would have been more concerned about London than about Massachusetts. And I think this highly nationalist, Americanist view is actually a very novel one. Historically, it was almost never the case that presidential elections, even in like the 1820s with Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson, even then, presidential elections barely ever caused more voter turnout than gubernatorial elections. And I think this really all changed around the Civil War era, actually. And discussing the nation in unifying terms has given way to this expansive role for the federal government, which I think has led inevitably to general election being contests in which one political party states, in modern terms, attempts to strong-arm an agenda through federal means. And furthermore, I'd argue that this equally activist and expansive Supreme Court that we've seen more recently in the last century, as Ben alluded to, have further enabled this abuse that I don't think the Founding Fathers ever intended for. And even the Federalist proponents, by the way, of the Union, of the Constitution, of this stronger central institution, recognize and valued states as a legitimate entity. This is beating the dead horse again, and go to the James Madison point. He wrote in Federalist 39 that the Constitution, on one hand, is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America, but also, sort of paradoxically asserted that the Constitution is also composing the distinct and independent states. So basically, these individuals are composing these distinct and independent states. He further declared, by the way, the federal government's power was partly federal and partly national. Moreover, he precisely dictated later that the Constitution is in operation of these powers, not national, not federal, but instead federal, not national. There's a very clear distinction in how he viewed the scope of federal government, the source of legitimacy, and the extent to which it could be governed. It was a very precisely written document. And we have tossed out any notions of this federal kind of view, basically the notion that states are legitimate institutions. A key example is the 17th Amendment, which made senators directly elected, and I think completely disregarded the Founding Fathers' intention that the two legislative chambers represent the people and the states respectively. With that being said, though, I think the solution, at least in my mind, is rather a difficult one. I think we should embody Madison in the sense that he was a moderate by all means. He sat, I think, in between the kind of political spectrum of, say, John Dickinson, who didn't even want independence up until '76 and voted against it on July 1st, and Jefferson and Thomas Paine on the other end. And I think just in that principle, we have to withhold the temptation to weaponize the federal government to advance political agendas that are completely outside any delineation of power vested in it by the Constitution, at least given the reading from the Federalist Papers. And I think this is a problem on both sides of the modern political aisle. And in my mind, this must be a hard-drawn line regardless of any sort of political expedient. Institutions exist and must be respected.
So, I guess to open, like, the regular question of something that's been lost in 1776, I take the opinion that the revolutionary spirit of 1776 has never really disappeared, partially because America still really hates taxes. There's really nothing America hates to do with taxes. But I suppose in all seriousness, like, the idea of revolting against some sort of oppressive system, something that's taking away your rights, that has never really left the American specter. That has always been haunting behind every sort of political movement in this issue. The idea that your rights would be taken away if you were to do that action, and they believe that your rights have been taken away since the action has been taken to repeal whatever oppressive action is being done. So in that basis, 1776 was never really left on national purview on any side of the political spectrum. Except maybe, as the Platypus discussed with the modern left, just trying to completely remove 1776. But even so, like that's still defined within the paradigm of the revolutionary understanding of society. In doing so, I think this caused necessarily societal decay, because in trying to liberate yourself from some oppressive force, you start to try to liberate yourself from anything that can all become an individual. As you said, the Bible says, become more active than just be. And in that becoming, you liberate yourself from things that pretty much created society. You remove yourself from churches, you remove yourself from your community, and you remove yourself from your family in some aspects. And I mean, like my colleague Ben said, a lot of families have been utterly destroyed recently. I think there is a societal undercurrent to it. As far as things that I think that we could salvage, which I do think the legacy of 1776 is quite dangerous to touch on, is early in the period in which the revolution was done, the legal understandings that people had did have some basis in constitutional law and natural law. You can find them in American history. You can find Supreme Court decisions that reference those two things. But currently now, if you reference pretty much either of those things, you're laughed out of major institutions, especially natural law, at least according to Richard Epstein, which actually lectured at the University of Chicago. He's a pretty good guy. But in doing so, I don't know what basis the American law has now without referencing natural law, or if you go any farther, referencing God, which made up a large part of natural law theory, at least how we understand it in the West. So, I mean, if you were to take that stance, then you would have something that society is oriented towards. Because either you take a non-deterministic view, which history just kind of happens, and there's no purpose that you're driving towards, or there is no end in which you are moving.
Do you mind if I respond to,
those aren't
like before I go into these remarks, I respond to some of, because the guys emphasizing the nationalist part, I do want to say, like, no, this is about
There's really no focus on
international
the future.
American
Yeah,
revolution.
you can make a position.
At the beginning, before I go into the remarks.
Very present driven, as you can see, with a lot of the political actions we get. We want satisfaction now. We want people to have jobs now, rather than actually, trying to build an economy that isn't built on, say, banks that have bailed out and will fail over and over and over again when interest rates go up. So yeah, I think that our biggest issue, and I think that this goes down to an individual level in a lot of cases, is that the time preference of Americans and American society is basically non-existent. Everything must happen as fast as possible without any sort of thought about what it might do to your future and other people's future. And yeah, American society has very little understanding of what it means to be an actor. I don't think that there is something that we ultimately know that can happen, at least in the sense where there's no divine revelation coming down. So you have to make your own history. You have to understand what you're going for. And if you don't have a goal, if you don't say, well, I mean, I guess the most thing you have towards a common goal for the American system is the American dream, and even that is thrown into question. You say that, well, maybe I didn't get to become someone who was able to live in some sort of luxurious lifestyle. Maybe my kids will. That thought isn't going through a lot of people's minds in current American society. And that is I think that's a notion that we cannot stand, that we cannot live with. And if you attempt to live with that, it ultimately leads to society we can't talk about. And if the society starts to decay and everyone becomes individuals, maybe we'll get to see if the state of nature is a real thing. Because if everyone's an individual, the only thing that matters is contracts. If contracts are the only thing that matters, why would you ever make them? Why don't you make them? I suppose that, I hope that makes sense. I think it does. Yeah, I believe my time is up.
Master Platypus, wherein lies the failure of 1776? Can the legacy be redeemed? If so, how?
Right. I do have prepared remarks, but first, I actually did want to say something in response to what we just heard. Just to center this discussion more in the present. Like, I think all our speakers have expressed like discontents with present American society on the basis of the American Revolution, and yet present American society is, of course, the product of American Revolution. So what do we make of that? Why has the American Revolution seemingly gone into crisis? Another thing to like kind of signpost my remarks is like on Ben's point about nationalism. We've been speaking a lot about America, even on the Platypus side, but I want to emphasize the American Revolution is not a national event. For instance, the American Revolution directly causes the French Revolution. Not only Lafayette, like everyone knows Lafayette, but of course the French state becomes bankrupt because they fund the American resistance, the American Revolution. And although the American revolutionaries called themselves patriots, right? I'm a patriot. Crucially, there's a brotherhood of patriots. So American patriots are allies with French patriots, who are allies with English patriots, who are allies with German patriots. It's a brotherhood of man, brotherhood of patriots. It's not this insular nationalist, which is really a product of the 20th century. But another point on why we're talking about American Revolution is not just about America, like in case anyone... 19th century? Okay. It's not just about America. It's because the American Revolution belongs to the world. You go anywhere in the world, everyone will know about the American Revolution. I'm from Hong Kong. In the 2019-2020 protests, people were talking about the American Revolution. Oh, but they're not American. They have small eyes or something like this. No. Because the ideas appeal to the world internationally, right? That's why we're talking about the American Revolution. It's not just about some insular national event. It belongs to the world. It belongs to the people of the world. And of course, the left of today, the dead left we will consider, want to take that heritage from the people of the world. Okay, but anyway, we can talk about that in my remarks. I actually speak on my prepared remarks. 1776 was a radical confirmation of the global social revolution out of feudalism into bourgeois society. The changes that inaugurated a global society based on free labor, which demanded liberty, equality, fraternity, and the submission of the state to the free development of new forms of life taking root in civil society. At the heart of bourgeois society and the social relations which gave it form is the freedom of humanity to self-legislate its own direction, and the self-consciousness of this freedom. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, gave human labor and productivity, acting globally in cooperative exchanges, as the point of departure for the possibility of this radical vision of enlightenment. This also implied the unproblematic appropriation by society of new technical improvements. Smith gives the example of a young chimney sweep who, through his own ingenuity, invents a device to assist him at his job, which allows him to clean chimneys more efficiently and gives him more leisure time in which he can develop his own individual capacities. Smith argued that this process, globally over time, would lead to the unfolding of social freedom, freedom which would be achieved by the actions of social individuals. The relation of individual and society, or more commonly stated, individual and collective, was not that of antinomical antagonism, but a productive dialectic in which the development of the capacities of one which would help unfold the capacities of the other. So it's not this individual versus collective. Karl Marx affirmed the radical transformative possibility of bourgeois society, but identified a new historical problem that emerged in the 19th century that threw bourgeois society into self-contradiction: the Industrial Revolution, which generates society's own alienation; capital, which constrains and dominates society's free unfolding. For Marx, the problem is not one of oppressor versus the oppressed, because the capitalist class too is just as constrained and dominated by the logic of capital as the workers are. Capitalists, for Marx, are merely the powerless character masks of the logic of capital. The problem of capital is society's self-domination. So it's not just one group oppressing another group. This is how it's usually talked about, like sociologically. Society's self-alienation expressed as capital manifested itself as the problem of wage labor, the proletarianization of bourgeois society. While wage labor did exist in bourgeois society before the Industrial Revolution, it was marginal, a fringe phenomenon. In capitalism, the general condition of labor has become wage labor, in which the whole population is subjugated to competition with machines. Rather than technical improvements being appropriated by artisans and independent craftsmen in high bourgeois society, technical improvements make human labor superfluous and introduce a historically new form of poverty of overproduction, not just underproduction, but overproduction. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century threw Adam Smith's vision into an interminable self-contradiction. The whole human population is not now simply productive laborers adding to the wealth of the nation. They are also hungry mouths to feed in search of a job. In the words of Max Horkheimer, machines make not work, but the worker is superfluous. A social form founded on the equality of labor was brought into contradiction with an industrial form of production, which undermined human labor as value-creating activity. Yet labor, according to our social consciousness, is still the measure of universal value. The intensive development of technology posed the imposed the possibility to overcome labor as value and further develop social freedom. Yet this was blocked by the very bourgeois social relations which conditioned its existence in the first place. For Marx, socialist politics must be grounded in the class struggle of the newly created proletariat, because only they could critically enunciate the problem by objectifying the self-contradiction of labor at all levels of society and politics, as their existence was founded on the basis of this self-contradiction. The proletariat was tasked with abolishing itself in order to abolish all classes. Socialist politics at its height in the Second International grasped the problem of capitalism not as one as unfairness or social justice, but rather as a problem of freedom. The left is dead today because it has traded a politics of freedom for a politics of social justice, which has resulted in the supplanting of 1776 with 1619 by the dead left, a left which has become merely the Democrats. Where does this leave 1776 for Marxists? The class struggle of the 19th and 20th century was the critical appropriation of the ideals laid out by Adam Smith, Rousseau, and Jefferson, but faced with the new problem of industrialization. So in other words, socialist politics comes out of the American Revolution. It's not like just opposed the American Revolution. It's not a counterculture phenomenon. It comes out of the American Revolution, out of the ideals of the American Revolution. The left at its height contained a critical recognition of a problem of bourgeois freedom. The desire to labor and the pursuit of happiness is no longer simply reproducing a freer and freer society, something which Rousseau, Smith, and Jefferson could safely take for granted. Rather, the pursuit of freedom generates a new form of unfreedom, capital.
Simultaneously, however, the new industrial forces of production pose the possibility of a radically freer society than even the Enlightenment could imagine, by immensely improving the productivity of labor far beyond their conception. Bourgeois social relations are more and more outstripped and undermined by rapid industrial and technical progress, and yet the potential latent in this to revolutionize human life appears to be outside humanity's conscious direction. To quote Max Horkheimer, today's possibilities are no less than despair. This new historical condition of unfreedom generated further problems at all levels of society, in the economy, psychology, philosophy, and most importantly for Marx, politics itself. Marx observed in the aftermath of the first proletarian revolution, the revolutions of 1848, and by the way, I'll add in here, I think the same problem that I'm about to describe is descriptive of America in 1830 as well, the Jacksonian counter-revolution, but still I'll get into it. A new political condition in which the state now rose above society and attempted to manage the crisis of its proletarianization, contrary to the spirit of 1776 in which the state was to be subordinated for civil society's ends. The new capitalist state responded to the bourgeois discontents of the workers' struggle for the value of their labor with the growth of an administrative bureaucracy. The police, welfare, the standing army, and the administrative state emerged from the new capitalist state after 1848. The birth of modern capitalist politics posed the need of an independent party for the working class to critique the class struggle in order to advance the self-consciousness of the workers, which could only find its necessary endpoint in the workers' final seizure of the capitalist state and the smashing of the capitalist state's special bodies of armed men, the police and the standing army. Marx called this the dictatorship of the proletariat, which could open up the possibility of a social revolution and force the clarification of the problem of capitalism at a level to make it potentially politically tractable. The independent party of the working class was intended to lead the workers to a revolution and open up the doors to the realization of the potential latent but unfulfilled in capitalism. It was not a political party that sought to administer capitalism like the Democratic and Republican parties today. Rather, it sought to realize capitalism, a realization which could only mean its overcoming. As Eugene Debs put it in his speech at his acceptance of the Socialist Party of America's presidential candidate in the 1900 election, quote, "The contest today is for the control of government by three separate classes with conflicting interests, into which modern society has been divided in the development of the competitive system. The capitalist class is represented by the Republican Party, the middle class by the Democratic Party, the working class is represented by the Social Democratic Party. Each of these parties is committed to the economic interests of the class it represents. The Republican platform is a self-congratulation of the dominant capitalist class. Prosperity galore, give us 4 years more. The Democratic platform is the wail and cry of the perishing middle class, calamity without end. The Social Democratic platform is an indictment of the capitalist system. It is the call to class consciousness and political action of the exploited working class, and it is a ringing declaration in favor of collective ownership of all the means of production and distribution as the clarion voice of economic freedom."
The left today has abandoned the political independence of the working class. It uncritically affirms its attachment to the capitalist state as yet another racket in the Democratic Party. Working class organizations have become totally integrated into the Democratic Party as well, asserting themselves as a mere constituency group among others desperate for paternalistic protection from the state. In Platypus reading groups and public fora, we raise the specter of the radicals of the Second International like Eugene Debs, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Trotsky, because the world revolution of 1917 to 1919 was the highest attempt to realize the historical self-overcoming of capitalism. We do not raise their writings in order to take away any positive lessons about what position the left should take on any given issue, but to contrast their moment with ours, in order to articulate what's lacking in the present. The left didn't die overnight, but its death is the product of compounding repetitions of defeats, failures, and obfuscations that characterize the 20th century left. The Frankfurt School critical theorist Theodor Adorno observed the same regressions in the theory and practice of revolutionary politics manifested in the authoritarian student pseudo-activists of the 1960s New Left. Quote, "The liquidation of theory by dogmatization and thought taboos contributed to bad practice. The interrelation of both moments of theory and practice is not settled once and for all, but fluctuates historically. Those who chide theory for being anachronistic today obey the topos of dismissing as obsolete what remains painful because it was thwarted. The fact that history has rolled over certain positions will be respected as a verdict on their truth content only by those who agree of Schiller that world history is the world tribunal. What has been cast aside but not absorbed theoretically will often yield its truth content only later. It festers as a sore on the prevailing health. This will lead back to it in changed situations." And quoting from an article from the Platypus Review from a few years ago, Platypus is dedicated to reopening various historical questions on the left in order to read history, quote, against the grain, as Benjamin put it in his theses on the philosophy of history. Attempting to grasp past moments of defeat and failure on the left, not as given, but rather in their unfulfilled potential, regarding the present as the product not of historical necessity, but rather of what happened that need not have been. We struggle to escape the dead hand of at least two preceding generations of problematic action and thinking on the left, the 1920s and 30s and the 60s and 70s. More proximally, we suffer the effects of the depoliticization, the deliberate postmodernist abandonment of any grand narratives of social emancipation on the left in the 1980s through 90s, end quote. Regression is not simply a linear process, but itself is constituted by missed opportunities. If we've fallen beneath 1776, we cannot simply take up where the Founding Fathers began, as our present is constituted by failures, missed opportunities. The left's affirmation of 1619 and its rejection of the spirit of 1776 is symptomatic of its general decline in the 20th century. We agree with the thinker that the left is the greatest obstacle to the revolution today. We disagree, and that we maintain that a left which took up the question of freedom is the only possible agent of the revolution. But as stated earlier, in order to change the world, we must first change ourselves. The left is dead, long live the left.
Before the responses, and thank you again for responding to both the questions, I just want to remind everyone that after these responses, we'll turn to a Q&A, and so, keep that in mind, generate questions, and then we'll call you after these 5-minute responses. Okay.
All right. I guess one new question that I have, I'd love some commentary from you guys about class differences today, and how, I guess, the American Revolution and your vision for the future relates to the current class structure of the U.S. What's wrong with it? What does the ideal look like? And I guess the second thing I want to say is, I agree with you. So I like how you highlighted the international impact of the American Revolution. And I agree with you with the Platypus people that the American Revolution has inspired people around the world to embrace democracy and basic freedom. I think that's a good thing. I would also like to highlight that the American Revolution was the first anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle. And it was the first time that, one of the first times at least, that a portion of an empire broke off and became a nation state. And the modern state, especially the nation state, is one of the most powerful tools that exist for making the world a better place for humanity. I mean, semi-functioning African states becoming semi-functioning states as opposed to what they were before has done way more for the well-being of people in Africa than Bill Gates and all of his bed nets combined, if we're being honest. And I would argue that globalism in general, especially globalism based on a Western sort of elite progressive or elite liberal understanding of things, is kind of more harmful than good in a lot of settings. For example, in Afghanistan, we tried so hard to build a progressive feminist democracy in Afghanistan, and it was an epic flop. And I think a return to more like nationalism and international nationalism is good.
Okay. I think just out of the curiosity, one thing that the Platypus comments made me think of in particular was just this kind of complete rejection that the Founding Fathers had of privileges more generally. They were especially adamant against hereditary privileges. Thomas Paine famously put the monarchy essentially on full blast, questioning why it was that, King George III can have a child, have a son, and that son, what gave this son the right to be the next king of England? I think it is also true at the same time that John Adams, in some of his earlier writings, certainly envisioned this more collectivist society. He broadly supported public education. He wanted this kind of cohesive participatory politics, which I do agree that a lot of the Founding Fathers hailed from. However, I just want to kind of throw this question at the Platypus, and I'm wondering, in this system of thought that you've laid out, where would this distinction between this rejection of hereditary privileges, of noble titles, fit in with respect to, say, the promotion of merit, which I would argue the Founding Fathers ultimately did support and did seek, in the sense of, I guess, to reframe the question a little bit, is there a necessary distinction between equality of opportunity that the founders sought in terms of this new millenarian American empire versus this kind of broader, equality of outcome, this kind of talk of equity that we see a lot on this new left, which you have deemed as dead?
So, let me go there. I guess the revolution that we're talking about, the revolution that Platypus would like to take up, establish and take back from the left and apparently keeps it from happening, is that, I guess the question is, what is the end of that revolution? And the only thing that can bring it about is essentially a collective, which is whether it be the left or whether it be the proletariat or any of those sorts of groups. Like what happens to the human being after that? What is that human being's necessary end? I know that there is, at least in your paradigm, and I hope I'm not if it's wrong, there is an end to history. There's ultimately something that will always happen. There's a determinism that's around there. But once that determinism happens, what ultimately is then the goal of an individual's life? Because it seems to me that people need something to orient their life towards. And if there is an end to the revolution, maybe in some ways, while there's no end to the revolution, people will keep orienting their lives towards trying to achieve that revolution. If there is a revolution and there is an end to it, what then becomes the end of humanity? And I personally don't think that the human necessarily have an end that is divorced from the end of the revolution, or that is necessarily tied to the end of the revolution. So I'll end there.
Should I also start?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Right, I guess I'll start with maybe to apologize. Maybe some of you are disappointed in some of our remarks. We didn't do the typical left thing to say, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, or something like this. But there's a reason why we didn't say that. Of course, it's very easy to propagandize, but Platypus's thesis is that the left is dead, right? As in, it's not sleeping. It's not lost its way. It's dead. It's dead. We're starting from ground zero. A new left has to be rebuilt completely, like from ground zero. Also, that the left is an obstacle to today's future revolution, and really, like a socialist revolution is not on the table. Like, there's no Eugene Debs today. There's no Socialist Party of America today, and yet there's still the problems, at least the problems, which we believe was most manifested by socialist politics, which was most identified by socialist politics in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. How we have these ideals of the American Revolution of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and yet those ideals seem to be contradicted all the time. And more than that, actually, they seem to be contradicted more and more despite the attempts to fulfill them. So I believe, Ben, you said like you castigated neoliberalism, but like neoliberalism, Reagan, Milton Friedman, that was itself conceived as another American Revolution. Like that was the attempt. That was the attempt to realize the American Revolution. Milton Friedman wanted freedom of civil society to self-organize itself away from the bureaucratic measures of the state. Of course, Reagan. It's the society we live in today is the product of many attempts to repeat the American Revolution that all seem to fail and contradict themselves and produce, end up with more and more capitalism, to put it bluntly. I had something else to say. Somebody else say something. I can't remember.
So I'll take up next to you. I'll take up your remarks of the question of, first you raise the antinomy between the collective and the individual. Then you raise the question of like an end of history. I would not affirm that what Marxism historically stood for, although you are correct and this is what it ended up becoming, is realizing some like end of history. What was actually meant was not that the revolution was going to happen. It was actually the question of how it was necessarily posed from the present. Dealing with the issue, to like link into that, the deal with the individual and the collective, it's not a question of Marxism reducing individuals to like a collectivity, or like that's like the ends of socialism. This would be understood by Marxists in the sense that society as it's currently constituted turns people into a mere collective. The socialist political party was meant to be like a mediating force for the concerns of individuals, not treating them as a collective. But in the failure of the revolution, this is what they merely became. It's just like the sort of like receptacle for just like mass atomization, just like mere collectivity. The question would actually become like, how is it that actually we could restore the individual as a force in the world? Not the human being, because actually the point wouldn't be to uphold the human being as the thing, because that would actually take humanity as an end in itself, where if we're actually going to be treating the concept of freedom seriously, we actually would be able to like posit the idea that we could actually go beyond humanity. However, of course, in the world we live in, that only has like horrific connotations, and we of course wouldn't want to go beyond humanity, since that seems to be the only thing we can hold on to in like capitalism. It's like, at least I'm still human, but maybe you're not.
There's a lot to respond to with both the questions and also the presentation. So one thing I wanted to just sort of broadly notice, I suppose, by your presentations is that what is being depicted by the right is a genuine self-contradictory discontent related to democracy and liberalism, the counterposing of democracy and liberalism. And I'll say that that's not simply a thought error on their part, but rather actually reflects a real historical problem in the present. And also you see a self-contradictory view of history, or in relation to the founding of the country, as like, are we going to mark a continuity or discontinuity in the current project of the American, I think how you depicted it was like we need like an end goal, or we need some kind of goal, not an end goal, But so like, is this in continuity or discontinuity with antecedent American history, i.e. the American Revolution, and should we break with the Constitution? And I think, again, that's reflective of a real historical problem that Marxism is trying to grasp symptomatically. So I'm taking what you're saying as a genuine issue. And same thing for individualism versus collectivism is a reified projection from the present onto like the founding fathers, which these terms individualism versus collectivism would not have made sense to people before capital self-contradiction of like ideology.
Also, I remembered what I was going to say. It was in response to Ben. You said you wanted like class analysis from us. Like, what do we think about the class structure of America? I could give you statistics, or I could give you like I read Henry Braverman's Slavery and Monopoly Capital. You know that book?
That's
That's a good book. Yeah,
That's
it
good.
is a good book. But no, yeah, like this is one of the points we raise in Platypus is like, does class struggle even apply in the present in the absence of a socialist party? Like if I get kicked in the face by my employer and then I kick him in the face, is that class struggle? Is that pointing towards a new society? That's also why in our presentation we try to take a philosophy of history roots. We're trying to emphasize that Marxism is not about like the interest group of the workers. No. Not the interest group of the oppressed. It's not about that. It's a social transformation. It's a total social transformation, historical transformation, right? That's the purpose of it. It's world historical. It's not this grubby interest group politics as a constituency of the Democratic Party. Well, that's what it leads to. So yeah, does class struggle even happen today? In the absence, class struggle only has meaning for Marxism insofar as it leads to socialism. If it doesn't lead to socialism, it's just animals tearing each other apart. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for all your responses and for all the prepared remarks and for all the responses to the prepared remarks. We're now going to transition into a question and answer period. So if you have a question, then raise your hand, speak out loud. We don't have a microphone, so we just have to go for it. Yeah, in the center aisle.
Thank you for the talk. Although I'm slightly disappointed. Because there were only really two moments in which black people or just people of color in general were mentioned. Once to maybe politically state that the civil rights movement was good and that affirmative action was bad at another moment. If I take the American Revolution holistically, there are two pieces that stick out to me. The fact that the proclamation line of 1763, which barred American colonizers from going out west and obliterating, as they did, indigenous groups, came to mind, as well as, the British showed in the culmination of its abolition of slavery in 1830 that through each colony it was going to eradicate chattel slavery. Of course, the British had something else in mind. They turned to enslaving the entire subcontinent India, and that's why they didn't need slavery. But American colonizers, the so-called founding fathers, were also pretty interested in preserving slavery. In the account given by both sides, it might give another side about freedom. Perhaps there's a different conception of freedom you all need to insert here. Where do people of color at all figure in your account? I'm just disappointed by the paucity of different perspectives. And with that, I am done. I'm leaving.
Okay.
You guys want to go first? You can go first.
Yeah.
I think I'll just say we did treat that with a light touch because we didn't want to go into like a historical graphical debate. I think that's better left to other historians like James McPherson or Gordon Wood. You can read their books. That's why we tried to stay on the level on philosophy of history and its meaning for. Oh, there we go. And its meaning for the present. What I'll say about slavery is that, of course, slavery remained after the American Revolution. But of course, the fact of the American Revolution, the principles that it enunciated, led to the abolitionist movement, for instance. Like the abolitionist movement saw itself as fulfilling the promise of the American Revolution. They might have accused the American Revolution of hypocrisy, but how can you be a hypocrite without actually having those ideals in the first place? And of course, that's also why we raised Jefferson, because even though Jefferson owned slaves, Northwest Ordinance, he banned slavery in the Northwest Territories with the understanding that slavery would eventually become extinct, but also the banning of international slave trade. But also more interestingly for perhaps socialism, he wrote a letter to Francis Wright in 1925, near the end of his life, where he affirms Robert Owen, utopian socialist Robert Owen's, 1825, of course not 1920, where he affirmed utopian socialist Robert Owen's experiments to improve the lives of working class people as a way to abolish slavery.
Could I add one
That's
thing?
adequate. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think that the pseudo left today, I think, takes the prevailing values of our society as simply a sham. Whereas Marxism is a bit more peculiar in that it identifies the values that we hold to be revolutionary, the values of bourgeois society to be revolutionary, but it is also violated by the contradiction of capitalism. So it's simultaneously a sham and a promise at the same time. And not only that, it's the only promise that we have to work with at all. Marx says something even more extreme. He says that the workers have no new ideals to realize. All we have are the prevailing ideals that we have today, which are revolutionary ideals, but that aren't lived up to. And yeah, I think that on the issue of like racism in America, that this is the same. It's asking that society live up to the revolutionary values that it holds. And to the extent that we can't live up to them, I think Marxists historically identified capitalism as preventing those things. Yeah, but then again, to take Eugene Debs, we were quoting from a lot, he has a famous quote where he says that socialism is nothing special to offer black people, and the point being that there isn't, any sort of, it's the same oppression that's, alienating all of society, and some people are hurt worse by it, but that's not the sort of central category of freedom that, that is offered by socialism, or that is trying to be unlocked by socialism.
I would also just add like one quote to just kind of like place where a lot of like bourgeois thinkers at the time were like thinking of Kant and what is enlightenment. They'll say, we do not live in an we do not live in an enlightened age, but we live in an age of enlightened men. The difference being that it's presumed it's like, no, we actually do not live in freedom, but we live in a state that's actually going towards freedom. So the present is inadequate to what should be, but the fact that we can historically pose what should be, but what is not, actually poses the possibility for change.
I might. Do you mind if I say? Okay, I'll say one last thing. Of course, like again on this point of racism or slavery. Of course, what's remarkable about bourgeois society is that it's only after bourgeois society that slavery is abolished. Slavery has existed in traditional civilization for thousands of years, in every civilization imaginable, right? But it's only after the American Revolution, it's only after bourgeois society that the idea of abolishing slavery can even be conceived, right? Like, Spartacus, the Spartacus revolt? Spartacus didn't want to get rid of slavery, right? He wanted to get rid of his slavery, not slavery as such, or at least insofar as we know about Spartacus. But to bring this to the present, I'm sorry, taking up the thinker's time, but like why are we so opposed to this, like in our remarks about like 1619 and like trying to cast history in a different light? Is because it overlooks capitalism, right? Like if we say that America is, and always will be white supremacist, of course, then the struggle for socialism is impossible, right? That really just means the struggle for socialism is impossible. It also obscures what needs to be done to overcome capitalism. I probably could put that. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think one thing we do need to make clear, though, is to look at the trajectory of the American colonies even before the American Revolution. First of all, it was during basically the beginnings of Jamestown. They first brought in indentured servants, basically, to work in place for the planters and those who essentially wanted to make a living, mining, trying to look for a bunch of gold to mine. But it turns out indentured servants aren't going to be indentured servants forever. These people are on contracts to work on land for a certain period of time, and afterward they're going to be free. So this creates an huge economic issue in which slavery, in all its obvious moral horrors, was a solution for back then. Slavery essentially meant that you have a set of people who are working for, these colonists for an indefinite period of time, and that solves the problem of, okay, these guys are going to potentially be leaving my, say, plantation if they're an indentured servant, and they might come back to do something to me. And I think another important factor to consider is that at least the kind of broader Patriot Coalition, as I know Platypus has alluded to a little bit, has a long history of anti-slavery, even going back to the early 18th century. This was mainly in contention against the Walpole Ministry. In 1710, the Virginia Assembly passed prohibitive duties, and they were, on the importation of slaves. They were among the first of many colonies to do so. This was a coherent agenda. They essentially had the political economic vision that slavery was remarkably inefficient and envisioned this kind of production, consumption-based society in which it would be much better off if the colonies cultivated manufacturers and essentially worked to make the largest consumer base possible. Because in this sense, this created most wealth. They were all going to essentially do their kind of farm subsistence plus farming, trade that away and be able to afford all the luxuries they ever wanted. I guess to the more recent point on the American Revolution and slavery, one thing to keep in mind there is that many of the founding fathers unanimously detested slavery. This actually included many of the Southern founding fathers as well. I know Gordon Wood, for example, as I think Desmond alluded to, writes a lot about this. They had basically envisioned that slavery would more or less end in 30 or so years. They viewed it as economically unsustainable and incompatible with modern commercial society. However, actually, furthermore, I would also like to add the point that in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote a massive condemnation of slavery. I think it was something like he said that George III was waging war against human nature, humanity itself, and ultimately that provision got scrapped. And I think for mainly pragmatic reasons, it turns out that a lot of the southern colonies that were required to sign this declaration had a huge slave population. The British Empire more broadly had faced slave revolts, namely in South Carolina, the Georgia area, with the Stoner Rebellion, and also these Maroon Wars that were being fought out in the British Jamaican colonies. And it turns out sugar is a pretty lucrative business for the British Empire. These are absolute cash farms for the British Empire. And as much as we can obviously, hindsight 2020, condemn the moral horrors of slavery and say how horrendous it is, and certainly it was the case that figures like Jefferson recognized this. I think they had to kind of have this delicate balance of, how are we going to ultimately work slavery or work the system of slavery out through legitimate institutions. And I think there was this unanimous view that you couldn't really push that through the Declaration of Independence. Otherwise, you risk losing the support of the southern colonies, and you ultimately then wouldn't even have an independent nation that could eventually, say, get rid of slavery. I just think there are many pragmatic concerns that certainly an anachronistic view of history would largely ignore.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, yeah. So why is the American Revolution excluded from that phenomenology spirit? Because this implies that we abstractly the notion of the American Revolution as a French Revolution, notion the differences in the notion of the American are excluded from spirits working out the common freedom. And so whatever deepening of the principle that you're arguing for actually excludes the American Revolution being part of the working out economy. Because concrete freedom develops from the actualization of negative freedom at a great time, right? So how does that work?
Ben, you want to do it?
Yeah, I haven't read the phenomenology, so I don't know if I can answer that question.
Well, I mean, it's,
I'll reiterate. Yeah, or you can go.
yeah, I mean, I don't know how to respond exactly. It seems like you're putting your question on quite philosophically high ground. I guess it's appropriate, but I mean,
Wait, one thing I'll say. Hegel somewhere remarks that the bourgeois revolution per se is the only successful slave revolt in human history. So I would just say that this is one slave revolt of mankind over its oppressors. That is the bourgeois revolution, and so it happened in America, it happened out in France, it happened in Haiti, It happened in England, in this time period.
Isn't Hegel a mark on the American Revolution? Am I making that
America
up?
is the land of the future.
Yeah, America is the land of the future from Hegel.
But if we're
I don't know,
going to
it's
talk
not
about
like
Hegel,
the
if we're going to talk about Hegel, this is seriously going to take 60 hours. So perhaps, yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I want to talk a bit about like your emphasis on philosophy of history, because it seems like if you're right and the left is dead, right, and we abide by the kind of, I'm not going to cite Hegel but like the sort of Hegelian Marxist philosophy of history, then it seems like there's nothing for theorists or philosophers to offer right now in terms of where we go in the future, because the whole owl of the nervous business, right? Like philosophy can only like interpret what's happened so far. We can't think of the future. Whereas it seems like, I think for most people, and this might just be a symptom of us being influenced by the pseudo left, but there seems to be like sort of a couple fairly obvious things we can do to make people's lives better, right? Like living wage, making sure people have health care. These things we can like debate over the details, but these things seem to be useful to some extent. And so I wonder if I contrast this aspect of.
I apologize. Can you like speak
Yes,
the
yes.
question?
Yeah.
We don't have that much.
So what do you think of that? Does your focus on the philosophy of history sort of paralyze important reform?
Well, the thing is also that Marxism wasn't just philosophy of history, but a living political project.
Yes.
Like, it wasn't just a way of thinking. It's not just a way of describing the world. Like Marx says in his thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers describe the world. The point would be to change it, but you probably know that. The other thing would be like, yeah, of course, like, I'm sure people's lives could be improved. And you probably don't need socialism to actually accomplish that. You could actually probably accomplish a lot of those within capitalism. The question that's still getting posed is like how those things are going to be accomplished in kind of distorted ways, in which are actually the way in which people think they're going to free people are actually just going to be the further unfolding of like more unfreedom. In the sense of just dealing with the welfare state, why does it exist in the first place? Is because originally it was passed as part of the anti-socialist laws to roll back the successful socialist movement in Germany by Bismarckian Germany. The development of the welfare state since then has followed in that same path, and that basically it makes people depend on the state, which is a point the right makes a lot. But there's actually a serious point to that, because of course it does make people depend on the state. And of course, actually accomplishing those things in capitalism will make people more dependent on the state. And the question is like, are we interested in making people comfortable and making their lives easier, or are we interested in the question of freedom? Like real social freedom, that individuals could actually...
Which entails the end goal in mind, yeah.
And which we derive from the American Revolution, right?
Yeah.
Like, are we living, is getting a living wage, is that really living up to what the American Revolution promised? Is that why, is that why the people died in Lexington and Concord or in the Civil War? Is it for a living wage? I don't know. Like, I'm not casting aspersion. Like, I sympathize with, everybody, the poor, the oppressed. Yeah, I sympathize with everything. But the point that Platypus attempts to raise is that does this actually point out of capitalism?
One thing briefly. So, following up on Clay's point, the struggle for reforms and changing capitalism tape is going to reproduce the next crisis of capitalism. That's one issue. And I also want to talk about, and I agree with everything everyone else said. On the first part of your question, like what is the point of theory today? I think that, at least from the Frankfurt School's perspective, we're reading in the reading group in the next few weeks that the theory today is impossible in the absence of practice. So that should also clarify that what we're not doing in our reading group or public forum activities is theory. If anything, what the Frankfurt School is trying to say is that the only task of thinking today would be to articulate the impossibility of theory in the absence of practice. And that thinking atrophies in the absence of practice, and practice also is blocked by the absence of theory as well. So it's a very difficult problem that we're in, and there isn't a theoretical answer there isn't a theoretical solution to the problem that we're in.
So, okay, anyway.
Sorry,
Yeah,
and I just want to redirect to the thinker. If you guys have a direct response, or based on what Pat was said, they came up with this notion of like, for what did people die at Lexington and Concord? But maybe if you wanted to address that question.
I'm going to address a slightly different question first. I'm a big fan of Otto von Bismarck's welfare state. I'm a big fan of the idea of Social Security, Medicare, the minimum wage, living wage. That's all great. It's also a great way to forestall the socialist revolution, which, like, conservatives, we don't want the revolution. We want to keep the
This guy's good. This guy's good.
So it's like, okay, this is great. We buy off the, maybe we make people's lives better so they don't overthrow us. That's how we do it. You mentioned something about why do people die like some people. Let's see. I think it's because they aspire to have basic freedom and not be oppressed by the British. That's why people die. And so we continue the legacy by providing people with basic freedom. I'm okay if I'm just thinking about that. I don't know if that.
Oh,
I mean, I suppose about the Lexington conference point. I mean, I might want to respond to your point. I think we talked about this more. But, I mean, about Lexington and Concord, I think that, I mean, of course, there's a very big split in the American society about what they really wanted. I mean, there were patriots and there were royalists and there were kind of people in the middle who just kind of existed and are not really written about in history. But, I mean, I think that the people who died in Lexington and Concord died for what they essentially died for what was written in the Declaration of Independence. I think that being the statement of the nation as it's intended to form, which was ultimately governed by the Continental Congress, I think that was their ultimate goal in mind. And even if they didn't expressly say that, that's what they were fighting for, and that those were the ideals that were ultimately going to be put in place in becoming society. So with that, they're ultimately fighting for the American form of liberalism that breaks away from the British tradition. I think that would satisfy.
We're heading close to time. We are fine staying over. We have the room and everything. We'll stay about 15 minutes over. That's fine with everyone. You know, you're welcome to go if you have a commitment already, but we'll go until 9:15, then we'll wrap up. Yeah. Go ahead.
So,
sorry.
So from your leftist dead perspective, you think that a constitution or a political doctrine that includes rights of the person, do you think that's incommensurate with left is dead? Or
Could you elaborate that,
Yeah.
actually?
I'm sorry?
Could you elaborate that?
So rights of the person, I mean, I'm obviously you're against private property, but let's think of, certain liberties that our Constitution or many other constitutions include. Do you think that sort of securing these rights, do you think that's incommensurate with, do you think that's incompatible with the leftism that you're pursuing?
As in the left wouldn't pursue those rights, or you mean people are pursuing them, but
It's totally orthogonal to what you want, to what you're pursuing.
The Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is part of the Constitution, like they enshrine bourgeois values and bourgeois rights in a certain sense, and they're contradicted by capitalism. When we say the left is dead, though, well, hopefully we still live in bourgeois society. If we don't still live in bourgeois society, then Marxism is irrelevant. So I'll just say, hopefully we do. When we say the left is dead, we're talking about a revolutionary agent that wants to change the world in a radical way, using a negative image or a negative utopia projection from the present. Anyway, that's what's lacking in the present, and it's not an argument about what the future constitution should look like.
And of course, it's precisely those liberal rights that this living socialist movement would actually be struggling for.
Yeah.
But it's actually in the struggle for those, they'd come up against the limits of those rights within capitalism, in the sense they would necessarily have to fulfill and overcome those rights as such to actually realize a society which realized the values of bourgeois society, but also pointed beyond them, because the potential of capitalism poses that we no longer need a society that's founded on the basis of the equality of labor, because labor has become superfluous. And yet, we still all have to labor, because that is the basis of our equality in the society. That's the meaning of that.
And to put a finer point on it, we will say the left is dead precisely because it doesn't stand up for the rights enshrined in the Constitution. For instance, free speech is not a value on the left, or by and large, or leftists will say many different things and say whatever, but they might claim they're for free speech, but they wouldn't actually struggle for the violations of free speech that are happening today. with Twitter files and such, or Julian Assange. They wouldn't, because they're tails of the Democrats, to put it bluntly. And actually, the violation of those rights is fertile ground for the struggle for socialism. Could become a struggle for socialism. Out of that struggle for those basic rights, which are contradicted by capitalism, but yet the left is dead precisely because it doesn't take up those struggles. If that answers your question.
You think rights are basically just a mirage?
I would say
No.
they're a sham, but also a promise.
Yeah, a promise and a sham.
Yeah, it's a promise and a sham at the same time.
Go ahead.
One thing I really liked about the first question that was asked is that it was posed from a progressive perspective. And I think that the perspectives we're going to hear in this discussion, conservative and Marxist, are sort of shockingly unrepresentative of contemporary intellectual activity.
Yeah.
And so I would like to give some voice to some perspectives, not my own, the progressive point of view. By way of asking, in light of the fact that Woodrow Wilson considered the Constitution to be obsolete, in light of the fact that the 1619 Project considers the American Revolution to have been fundamentally racist, from what deep societal and political imperatives do you think that these intellectual moves are being made? Why is it necessary? Why has it been necessary for approximately a century now for progressivism to in some way reject the American Revolution and its legacy? How would you account for that?
You can go.
So I think that the progressive move in attempting to destroy the history of the American Revolution, in at least some aspect, is an outgrowth of the liberal project itself. Because from the very beginning, the revolution is meant to be a liberating factor. And once liberalism comes into being, the end goal of liberalism is to liberalize where the name comes from. So once that starts to occur, if you ever get to a point in which things seem stagnant and social coherency seems to be there, that inherently means that someone is being oppressed by the system that was imposed. Because you have to remember the Constitution is largely considered and built to be a continuation of a tradition of British rights and understandings, which were necessarily oppressive in the first place. So by attacking the Constitution, by attacking the founding, and all of the premises by which American society is bought into, that necessarily entails revolution again, necessarily entails more liberation, which is ultimately the goal of people who have bought into the liberal project, and people who have bought into it the most are ultimately going to be the progressives in the Democratic Party, to be completely honest.
I'm going to add to that a little bit. So, in my opinion, okay, I'm a total cynic and don't take anything I say too seriously. But I see progressivism, especially like the weirder versions of it that we're getting now, as opposed to like Woodrow Wilson progressivism. I see it as driven by intra-elite class conflict. So many of the most hardcore progressives are members of the elite who aspire to an elite position and can't find a position that meets their elite qualifications. So like AOC is a great example of this. She got a college degree and then went to work at a bar. And then she became rich and famous by espousing this progressive ideology and developing a great Instagram profile. Actually, I think AOC is a really effective politician, but that's another thought. Anyway, so as I see it, like the 1619 Project, these other sorts of moves to like, I don't know, really like, in my opinion, okay, if you don't like the American founding, fine. Everyone has their issues with history, but like, I think the 1619 Project is a little bit absurd and kind of ahistorical. And I see it as an attempt by like Nicole Hannah-Jones and her tribe to get sinecures at universities. So like Nicole Hannah-Jones has a named chair that's funded by some billionaire NGO. I think she had it at UNC, but now she's going somewhere else. But anyway, she's like living it up. And like Ibram X. Kendi as well is rich because he's like sort of built people into going along with his thing, even though it's kind of ridiculous in my opinion. So anyway, maybe there are intellectually serious progressives out there who don't share my views, but that's my take.
I guess if I were to sort of address the Woodrow Wilson point a little bit, I'd almost refer back to what my answer to the second question was in citing the Federalist 39 by James Madison. I think I sort of have a almost different kind of cynical view for Woodrow Wilson. I think he knew exactly what the Constitution in its kind of original intent stood for, and the reason he kind of saw it as obsolete is because he needed to bend it in a sense so that he could through the national government essentially strong arm what he saw as progressive policy through. Like Madison said in Federalist 39, in the operation of these powers, the constitutional powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them, again, it is federal, not national.
Yeah.
And I think Wilson I think Wilson kind of had a good sense of this, and he wanted to essentially change this into both of them being national. He kind of, I think, had a disregard for this original institution as contrived by the Founding Fathers, as ultimately compiled in the Constitution, which is ultimately a document of compromise. And I think his kind of progressivism that took place during World War I was this novel national, whatever you want to call it, usurpation of powers that was kind of never on a level really anticipated nor intended by the Founding Fathers when they drafted the Constitution. I think he essentially bypassed any sort of prerogative that the states ultimately were to retain as intended by the Fathers. And like I said, just was looking to, through the national government, I see a problem. National government's pretty strong. I should use that and channel that to push all the policies I ever want through.
Okay, so Woodrow Wilson knew what he was doing. Yes, Woodrow Wilson did know what he was doing. The question of it being like the personal whims of Woodrow Wilson is like another issue, because it's the other problem of, it's the problem posing the question of like, why does progressivism historically need to basically deny the legacy of the American Revolution? Maybe if the revolution goes unfulfilled, progressivism is exactly what we want. Because if we can't live up to the promises of American Revolution, maybe we do actually need to totally reject it. That's a bit of like a polemical point, because maybe it's like you immediately respond like, well, we live in the product of the American Revolution, why do we want to reject it? But then the other end of like, but we can't really seem to fulfill it. So it sort of has this tension there.
It's worse.
It's worse. The question is, for Wilson, what kind of need was being posed that would actually pose the need to like, we need to basically give lip service to the Constitution, and then we need to basically act totally against it in political practice. And I noticed that like in one of your earlier remarks, you mentioned that we need to actually reserve ourselves to like respect the institutions we create. And the problem is that what that kind of does is turn politics into a matter of civic duty. But politics is actually geistic activity. Hegel. It's something that actually is the realization of the necessary. And that really doesn't have a moral content per se. The other thing with that is, where the fuck was I going with that? Let me see. Progressivism. Wilson. Oh yeah. The other, of course, Wilson wrote two things during his lifetime. One of them was his like piece where he's like, we need to give lip service to the Constitution, but basically like go against it in practice. The other thing he wrote was a praise of Bismarck's anti-socialist laws and welfare state program. These two things are not totally unconnected, in the sense the thing that's looming in the back of that is the crisis of capitalism, and the thing that the crisis of capitalism gave birth to, the living socialist movement, which was very strong in the United States at the time of Wilson's presidency. That's...
I'll just say one thing. Perhaps we've been too critical of left. We've forgotten our critiques of the right. So I'll do that now. Of course, I sympathize with what the thinker has said, especially Perry, I think coming from more libertarian, very classical, founding fathers perspective. But of course, from a Marxist perspective, this is chaotic, quixotic, whatever, Don Quixote, chaotic, right? From a Marxist perspective, of course, you can't just call for return to the founding fathers. You can't just call for a return to bourgeois society, because capitalism has already destroyed that. There's no returning back to a simpler time where people can own their own property, where people have their own little stores, where people are not lumpenized, where people are not unemployed, and desperate for state aid, we can't return back to that time because capitalism has already destroyed that. And all attempts to do so are frankly chaotic. And neoliberalism, in our most recent memory, with like the 80s and Reagan, like that was most recently an attempt to, roll back the state, put government back in its correct place, and yet look where we are today, as Ben has given many critiques. Each repetition of the American Revolution, of return to American Revolution, without the self-consciousness of Marxism, really just reproduces capitalism, just really introduces the next stage of capitalism. And this goes to the point of progressivism, because what is progressivism? It seeks progress. Progress in what? Progress in capitalism. Not to socialism, but in capitalism. Introduces a new stage of capitalism. I mean, I remember like Ed's original question was about like what this means today. Like why do progressives bring this up? Why is it such a striking issue today? I mean, frankly, it's because we live in a chaotic time. We're living in a new stage. We're moving to post-neoliberalism. We're moving out of our current stage of capitalism. Many things are uncertain. We have Trump, who is this huge threat to the Democrats, which, like we said in our remarks, the present seems to cast all of hitherto history in a different light, right? Because of the present, like we blame the past. It seems like we're trying to find the original sin of American society. Like where did it all go so wrong? And it must be because of Jefferson. It must be because of Christianity. It must be because of white people. It must have been all of these things, right? But it really says more about like the despair of our moments, that we find the need to look for an original sin in the American Revolution, rather than the failures of the left to advance the revolution. Yeah.
This is tangential, but the interpretation of the Constitution that motivated the progressives, or was in bed with the progressive movement at that point in time, was like the Beardian interpretation, which identified like the left and the right wing of the American Revolution with the Jefferson, the left, democracy, and then with like the Constitution being the right wing, the consolidation of it. I'll just make a pot shot at Ben, which is that that's your interpretation as well, and that goes to show that it is like the self-contradictory character of bourgeois discontents in capitalism that motivates both progressivism and the policy making choices, like the right-wing anti-imperialism that you're also presenting in your talk as well. So that's just a pot shot. But yeah, that's all I had to add.
Thank you again to all of our speakers for sharing their thoughts and opinions of the nation of the American Revolution, and for their high-level remarks on both history and contemporary implications of the American Revolution. We would also like to thank you for attending and providing questions to push the dialogue further. We hope you gain new insight and more nuanced understanding of the American Revolution. Thank you, and good night.